A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning if you happen to be on the other side of the hemisphere. Can you still hear me and can you see my screen?
Everything's perfect.
Splendid. Thank you very much indeed. Well, I should like indeed to say something about the music of Saint Nersēs the Gracious, a 12th century ecumenist, poet, hymnographer, as well as Catholicos, head of the Armenian Church. And I have good reasons for entitling it Chants, Corpora and Contrafacta. I will just start by mentioning the fact that I have just returned from this island just off Venice, the island of San Lazzaro, where there is a Mechitarist monastery that has been in continuous existence on the island for over 3 centuries, where I had the privilege of taking part in the liturgical and musical life of the island, which has a particularly splendid musical tradition, and where many of the chants composed by Saint Nersēs the Gracious were indeed performed liturgically. So I should first say something briefly about my motivation. Last year, all over the world, Armenian communities marked 850 years from the passing of the saint, and there were international commemorations in different places and a lot of conferences, which offered opportunities for a reassessment of his legacy in various genres and in various respects. In addition to that, I was invited to organize a musical group to perform at the Vatican as part of these commemorations at the Sistine Chapel, as well as at the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. And for this purpose, I needed to do several different things. First, I needed to be sure that I know what really belongs to the pen of the saint, because this is a problematic matter and not very clear in some instances. Then I made the decision to include musical variants from a variety of different geographical centers and integrate these in a rewarding way. And this was reflected also by the composition of the group, 29 handpicked singers from different parts of the world, but with the idea that everyone would sing everything. In other words, singers from Venice would also sing melodies from Constantinople and so on and so forth. As it happens, because of the tragedy of Artsakh, of Nagorno-Karabakh, the decision was sadly taken by the churches to postpone or cancel these events. But much of the work had already been done, and there were a lot of things I learned by engaging in such preparations. And there are a lot of rewards as well as challenges. The rewards, well, there is a very rich and attractive legacy of melodies, not just one corpus, but several corpora associated with places such as Venice, Constantinople, Vienna, New Julfa, and elsewhere. But the challenges, well, there are a lot of uncertainties, not least of which, and it is, of course, far from trivial, we cannot read the medieval neumes. We can elicit indirect information from them by carrying out, as it were, detective work on them, but we can only go so far. We do have melodies, and the melodies need to be studied in their own right. They can be compared to the inhumations in an instructive way, but ultimately the neumes need to be studied in their own right as well, and of course in conjunction with the text over which they are placed. And some of the interesting questions were, as I said, matters of authorship, characteristics of neumated sources, and the interrelationship between extant corpora of melodies and variants. In my talk, I shall try not only to present new information about the saint's musical oeuvre that I've been able to discover during my recent work, but also to try and demonstrate and exemplify some rather more general points that are, on the one hand, peculiar to the musicology of the Armenian sacred musical tradition, but which, on the other hand, nevertheless, I believe may have interesting parallels in the challenges addressed by my colleagues working on sister traditions, which I hope will be of interest to you and which will prove of benefit to me and be very, very instructive. Now, I started by mentioning issues of authorship. We have mutually inconsistent, if not downright contradictory, sources. First of all, attribution of hymns to particular authors came rather late in the Armenian tradition and may well be rather alien to the tradition when hymns were composed and they were anonymous. They were part of a body of liturgical chant that was deployed during the offices, and it was very, very rare indeed for any particular person, usually a saint, to be mentioned as author. So most of our lists which attribute hymns to authors came late in the tradition. The oldest manuscript I've seen, you can see on the extreme left-hand side, although for some reason I see that my image has been rotated 180 degrees. The codex has been rotated, sorry about that. Armenian is read as in Latin and Greek from left to right, so it's the image that is incorrectly positioned. The very first folio of this Venetian breviary does have a list of hymns with putative composers, but even this list, as most other lists, does not purport to be complete. The lists are, generally speaking, anachronistic, not always very credible. They do not profess to be incomplete. And I have listed here and placed photographs of various authors throughout the centuries who have discussed these matters or provided their own lists or attempted to advance on such matters of identification. The complications are several. Our author is stylistically highly varied, very, very distinctive and recognizable in some cases, but chameleon-like in others. As for our manuscript witnesses, such as hymnals and breviaries, they are not sufficiently old, and our earliest dated hymnal, copied in Jerusalem, bears the date of 1193. A further complication is that St. Nersēs's hymns appeared to have entered the hymnal in an uneven manner, with some hymns entering gradually in small groups, but different manuscripts from different locations see different hymns entering at different times. So they entered the hymnal in an uneven manner. I mentioned hymns. If we now briefly turn to the chants of the Divine Liturgy, which is a different genre, and where too we have testimonies that the saint contributed, there it would seem we have the benefit of the period in question being, as it were, framed by two well-known commentaries of the Divine Liturgy. There's one from the 10th century by Khosrov Antsevatsi, who was the father of St. Gregory of Narek, as it turns out. So that's a 10th century source. And we have another commentary, a later commentary from the late 12th century by another St. Nersēs Lambronatsi. So we have, therefore, some indirect information about the contents of the Divine Liturgy as it was celebrated by Armenians in the 10th century and at the end of the 12th century. But even then, we cannot automatically assume that anything not in the former but in the latter is necessarily attributable to our saint. I want to mention one further thing, which is a little disturbing, but Soviet-era musicology had the tendency to compare extant melodies of particular items and to jump to the conclusion that if there is a hymn of which it is known that the author is Saint Nersēs the Gracious, and we have some other item for which the present-day melody known to us is the same as for that of the item known to be of the saint, to jump to the conclusion that that second item too must have been composed by the saint. Now, this is very, very dodgy and really patently unsound, if I may say so, because of course the extant melodies have changed and they are almost certainly very different from what was sung in the 12th century. And moreover, we often have instances, well, I say often, we have occasional instances of items that bear different neumes, but the melodies now sung are the same. Likewise, we also have instances where the neumations of two items are different, but the present-day melody is the same. So that is no way in which to proceed to settle matters of authorship. But I would go one step further. I would say finding two items which have the same neumes, of which we know that the first one is by the saint, is also a very dangerous territory. We cannot say that the second item must also be by the saint just because the neumations are the same, because we have the phenomenon of contrafacta, to which I wish to turn in a moment or two. But before I do so, I want to say something about what I consider to be a sound methodology. Now, I mentioned contrafacta, but before I do so, I have greatly benefited from the work by a former abbot of San Lazzaro, the late Father Haig Utidjian, who had the wisdom not to make dogmatic statements, insisting that this or that could not possibly be by the saint. Rather, in the 1970s, in 73 and 74, he published two papers in which he created two categories, canons and hymns, of which the authenticity or of which the attribution to the saint remains indisputable in the light of manuscript evidence, and a second category, canons and hymns, about which we do not possess sufficient codicological information to be able to determine their authorship. And basically, the way in which he proceeded was the following. There is a very old hymnal in San Lazzaro, which is unfortunately undated because we have lost the colophon. There are pages, folios missing. It's manuscript San Lazzaro number 97. It may well be even older than the earliest dated hymnal, which is a Madanataran manuscript, the Jerusalem 9838 manuscript I had mentioned. And Father Utidjian compared the codices, these two codices, the Venice one and the Madanataran one. The Venice one is likely to be older. The Madanataran one is from the end of the 12th century, as you know. And he found a number of hymns that were, so to speak, new. They were not in the former manuscript, but were found in the latter manuscript. And moreover, the Jerusalem manuscript, the latter manuscript, has a characteristic in that most of the hymns in it are in highly abbreviated form. Abbreviated in two ways. Some of the words have been omitted, and those words that are there are themselves abbreviated. But in the case of hymns that were new, the full text and neumations had been given. The reason is the following, that the manuscript was probably used by a chanter or a teacher of chanters who already knew his hymnal inside out and knew it by heart. But he needed this as a reminder. Having a few of the words written, albeit in abbreviated form, was enough to allow him to remember each hymn in its entirety. But for the hymns that were new at the end of the 12th century, the entire text and nummations had to be written. So, in order for a hymn to belong to the pen of Saint Nersēs the Gracious, hymns needed to be new in this sense, as well as be grouped with other items known to be attributable to the saint. Of course, we cannot have 100% certainty, but that would, supported by information found on lists or descriptions by historians, of which the earliest is Giragos Kantsagetsi, who died in 1270, that would be a good guidance. And I'm very happy to say that Haig Utidjian of the Madenataran has been pursuing this further, also bringing into the equation a very old manuscript, an almost destroyed manuscript. It's basically fragments kept at the Madenataran Institute. So much about issues of authorship and their determination. Now let us turn to contrafacta. Contrafacta are a very well-known tradition, both in the West, but also in the Byzantine tradition, where we have an explicit group of melodies known as aftomela, and then contrafacta composed on the basis of those melodies, in other words, words created to fit in with those melodies, known as prosomnia. And yet, Saint Nersēs the Gracious has biographers, including early biographers, one of whom says, and though the words of his songs were wondrous to wise minds, yet even more astonishing was the art of his various melodies, which he would compose to be unlike each other. In fact, if we look at the neumes, we find that the situation is more nuanced, and it is not true that he only composed items that were unlike each other. First of all, the saint composed several hymns of his own to the same melody which he composed. So he himself created contrafacta. However, he also created new hymns on already existing melodies, judging from the nummations. And the same thing happened to him as well, in that a melody that he composed was used by a later hymnographer. And most interestingly of all, and I will try to give you examples of this in a moment, parts of the saint's melody were used later by other hymnographers. When I say parts, I will show you in very concrete terms what I mean. Particular motifs of the saint's melody were used afterwards, as represented, as embodied by groups of neumes. And I shall show examples of these different cases. So I'm referring now to the hymnal codex 154 kept in San Lazzaro that was copied in the capital city of Sis of Cilicia in 1295. And the hymns Naya Sirov, sung at Compline, as well as at Matins during Great Lent, are here. You can see the first three stanzas here. But there's also a hymn for Pentecost, Nujevnaman, here, belongs to the same mode, has the same meter. Sarsapeli Homonaman, also for Pentecost, it is here. And Voros Chorurt, which is the Cantimus hymn, part of the canon, the opening of the canon, for the 6th Sunday of Great Lent. And they are for completely different occasions. One is used for Compline, the other two are used on different days of Pentecost, and the last one on the 6th Sunday of Lent. So they're intended for diverse occasions. There is no discernible, obvious reason why the saint should have chosen to endow these particular hymns with the same melody, but that is what he has done, judging from the neumes, which are almost identical. I say almost. I don't have the time now to delve into the minor differences, but they're very interesting because they might give us a little bit of information about how things worked, maybe. The number of syllables of verbal text is the same in each cases, which makes it all the more puzzling why we have some discrepancies, but they're very minor. It's basically that the put and the push neumes do not occupy directly analogous positions in one of those hymns. And the odd man out is this one, the first one. The other three, as you can see, are the same. This is the refrain of each of these hymns. This is repeated at the end of each stanza, and there's this long neume or group of neumes. They are actually combined. Nonetheless, I think that for our purposes, we can say that they are contrafacta, and the difference, the minor difference in the numerations may be to do with the fact that although the number of syllables is the same, but in this case, we have the preposition E, which is unaccented, and so maybe for that reason, he wanted the melody to be slightly different. Nonetheless, essentially the same melody composed by this saint was endowed with 4 different sets of words for 4 different occasions. Now, an interesting case is that we find that if we compare any one of those with a much later hymn, a hymn composed in the 13th century by Hovhannes Blues Yerzengatsi, a hymn devoted to the holy grass eaters. These were monks who were vegetarian. If we make comparisons, we see that the saint's melody has been used by this later hymnographer. But there's an interesting twist to the tale. The music of the first line of each stanza, judging from the neumes, is different in the case of the new hymn. So only the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th lines of each stanza have had the neumes lifted from St. Nersēs by Hovhannes Blues for his own later hymn. And my blue arrows show the point in the stanza from where, again, the neumes in the later hymn by this later author replicate the earlier ones. Now, let us turn to another very interesting example. The first hymn is a very well-known hymn for Pentecost that is also used when water is being blessed, Arakelo Aravno. Most sources identify St. Nersēs the Gracious as the author of this, although Father Haig Utidjian thought that St. Nersēs of Lambron was more probable. Nonetheless, for our present purposes, let us assume that the saint is the author of the hymn on the left-hand side. I beg your pardon. I'm talking about the hymn on the right-hand side, which is a Pentecostal hymn, which most sources attribute to St. Nersēs the Gracious, whereas the hymn on the left-hand side are variously attributed to earlier saints. Essentially, the same numerations appear, and we find that the same numerations essentially appear also for the later 13th century hymn of vestment by Khachadur of Daron, Khorut Khorin, O Mystery Deep, that is performed in the beginning of the Divine Liturgy on most Sundays. But this seems to have continued even as late as 1807 in a Euchologion, a book of rituals published in Constantinople in 1807. There is an extra-canonical hymn that you can see here, Chachanish Choshmam, where there's a rubric that says, sing it to the melody of Khorut Khorin, the hymn by Khachadur of Daron. You will notice that most of the text does not bear any neumes, but there are crucial anchor points, as I like to call them, where we have these 2 different combinations of neumes that give us telltale signs that it's in fact essentially the same melody as we've got here, that group there and that group there respectively, by St. Nersēs the Gracious, and this earlier hymn, again, respectively, this combination here at that cadential point, and this one here. So the same melody seems to have been used before and after the saint, who may have served as a link in the process. But I say essentially the same neumes because the number of syllables are different. These hymns are in prose. They are not in verse. They do not have a fixed regular meter. And we have different numbers of syllables. And these syllables, being different in number, do not emulate each other precisely in terms of the neumations, although it is the same three simple neumes that appear in all instances, albeit not in exactly the same manner. But the anchor points are the same. And I would say it is a matter of argument and open to discussion whether we can consider such examples to be contrafacta or not. I will show very quickly a further example. This is a hymn that may either be considerably later or conceivably earlier, because there is an acrostic over the last two stanzas that makes the words Gyragos Vartabet, Archimandrite Gyragos. Almost certainly, Gyragos Yerzangatsi, who died in 1356, but conceivably Gyragos Tarkmanich, who died in 1127. And depending on which of those two authors one accepts, the saint either borrowed his melody or this chap borrowed the saint's melody. There are a lot of interesting things to say that arise out of a comparison of the hymns in question. The saint's hymn is Pan Vorantor, which is for the first Sunday of Lent, and you see that the neumations are almost identical. I'm convinced that there is an error there associated with the use of a majuscule, ornamented majuscule first letter, and indeed in this other source you can see that the correct neume is there. However, I say correct or incorrect with a great deal of uncertainty. Here it is, you can see it faintly. Now, things get more interesting when we find instances of highly melismatic hymns where we find the saint has himself exploited motifs for his hymn composed for St. Basil the Patriarch, St. Basil of Caesarea, on the right-hand side, and he has adopted sequences of neumes on successive syllables from an earlier hymn on the left-hand side. So what I've labeled as one, this set of hymns, but it's the same as number 4. The first neume is missing because we have an abbreviation here, and that's a bativ, an abbreviation sign. But in later stanzas, we don't have an abbreviation there. And so 1 and 4 here is exactly the same sequence of neumes as 1 here. So this part of the saint's hymn is reproducing exactly the melody of an analogous part in an earlier hymn. Likewise, for number 2 here, a melisma, a long melisma that consists of these combinations of neumes and significative letters placed beneath the neumes, here, if you can see my arrow, reproduces a similar chain in the earlier hymn that you can find here. Similarly, there's a third sequence of neumes on those successive syllables in the earlier hymn, precisely reproduced in the saint's later hymn. Now, we have a later hymnographer who composed this hymn, Hiatsan, dedicated to St. Nicholas, which seems to reproduce some of the combinations of neumes used by the saint, some of which are different. So this later hymnographer, who is probably also Johannes Blues of this later hymn, adopted bits from the saint's hymn, but some of the bits are not found in the earlier hymn. But the very opening is, as you can see here, Hiatsan here adopts the opening of the earlier hymn, same neumes, but otherwise it adopts different parts of the saint's hymn. So again, the saint's hymn, Lusabaidzar, dedicated to Saint Basil, which you can see on the left, served as a kind of link between the earlier hymn and a later hymn. So as you will see, we can reach complex webs of interactions between one generation and the next, between one century and the next even. And now I have let the cat out of the bag, and we reach a general principle, which is that often melodies of Armenian hymns recognizably constitute distinct families within a given mode, which are recognizable through the deployment of particular neumes. But it's not just the set of neumes that you find in those hymns that gives the game away, but we find recognizable sequences of neumes on successive syllables and recognizable combinations of neumes on particular syllables. And this was not lost on the 19th century redactors of the Armenian hymnal, who were able to notate exactly and in full melodies for the first time in the 19th century, using either Western musical notation or a newly invented Armenian notational system by Limōnčean and Father Minas Pezeshkian. And they noticed these things in the 19th century. They couldn't read the neumes anymore. They didn't know what the neumes meant, but they made sure that if they have some sort of a melody for one such hymn, then in such instances where, such as on this table, you can see this combination of neumes occurs, in all the hymns that belong to the same family, they would make a point of deploying the same motif in their realization of the hymn. And so those melodies that we have now at our disposal, transcribed for the most part in the 19th century, are not mere transcriptions of what was sung. They are realizations constituted according to those principles. Enough about the neumes. I should now like briefly to mention about the corpora of melodies that have reached us from different centers, such as Constantinople, Venice, Vienna, and New Julfa. And as I said, they were not merely transcribed, they were constituted, they were redacted. These are some of the Constantinopolitan musicians, church musicians, to whom we owe what they did. And in addition, there is something that is quite important. There was a hypothesis that I demonstrated to be quite credible by applying it in a different genre, a different repertoire, that of odes, but a hypothesis that was developed by Yeriadendesian, the great Constantinopolitan musicologist, regarding duration values of syllables bearing particular neumes or none. And this enables us to demonstrate, for example, that a particular melody for a particular ode of Saint Nersēs the Gracious cannot possibly be the 12th century melody composed by the saint, because the distribution of neumes on particular syllables is different, and because the relative durational values of melody sung over particular syllables of verbal text is at variance with that associated with the neumes. These are some examples. When I lectured in Armenia at the Madenataran Institute in June last year, a musicologist there claimed that the melodies we now have are the same as the 12th century melodies. So I spent a weekend finding these examples and demonstrating that the long and short syllables, when we have complex combinations of neumes, we can't compute the total duration. We don't know enough to be able to do that. We don't understand the grammar of the system. But for example, for the ode by Saint Nersēs, Nord Zarig, we have long, short, long, short, long, short, long for the first line, and long, short, short, long, short, long, short, long. This is a very primitive way of doing things, but it is enough to demonstrate that none of the melodies that we now have could possibly correspond to those neumations. Likewise with the ode Zaravetsav that we sang in San Lazzaro during Holy Week. Likewise with Parpar Avediats, the Annunciation ode. Now, let me return briefly to the chants of the Divine Liturgy to demonstrate one further general point. As the saint's biographer says, the saint composed them to soften hearts and minds so as to render them more receptive to the intelligible through the sensible. I took three sources where some of the chants for the Divine Liturgy, believed to have been composed by Saint Nersēs the Gracious, were to be found neumated. The earliest is 1241, then 1313, then 1377. And I compared the neumes of different chants in these sources. And I will demonstrate what I found, which is quite interesting. For chants such as the Sanctus or the Lord's Prayer, which are ancient things that were chanted long before Saint Nersēs's lifetime, the neumes for these items are very, very different from each other. So in the Paris manuscript of 1241, this is what you find the melisma for the first surp, which means holy, Sanctus. The Vienna, for the first surp, we have only this. For the second one, we have this, but it's also different. And for the Vienna manuscript of 1377, we have just this. For the Lord's Prayer, likewise, the neumes are quite different. That suggests that church musicians were at liberty to compose new melodies of their own, even within 150 years. But for those two chants ascribed to Saint Nersēs, the neumes remained quite invariant. They did not change at all over this period of a century and a half. What does that mean? I like to think that such was the respect and veneration in which the saint was held, that for melodies known to be composed by the saint, nobody dared to change the neumations. But we have to be careful. That does not indicate that they did not sing different melodies, merely that they retained the same neumes. That reduces us to the situation of the Armenian canonical hymnal, where we find that the same neumations were reproduced from the end of the 12th century at least to the 19th century. But the melodies did not stay the same. Every generation seems to have sought to compose its own melodies depending on its own tastes and its own inclinations, creating often melodies that were rather more melismatic and ornate than what may have gone before. And after all, in my view, that is one of the reasons why we seem to have lost the connection between the neumes. It is because the link between what was seen and what was actually performed became more and more tenuous, and people were more interested in their own melodies rather than in working out what may have been sung centuries earlier. There is, however, an interesting thing, which is that there is a kind of musical consistency that I do not have the time to define, and it is not easy to do so, between the melodies of different versions of items believed to have been chanted by the, composed by the saint in the 12th century. And I will end by briefly demonstrating to you the melodies of different stanzas of a chant that we performed in San Lazzaro during the Tenebrae service, the late night service on Maundy Thursday, well into the night. It took 5 hours this year. And I will provide you with the words. I will not sing the stanzas complete because I don't have sufficient time in which to do so, but I will give you a brief flavor of several different versions from One version transcribed in Calcutta in India, believed to be associated with the New Julfa tradition, Venice, Vienna, Constantinople, and I shall start, if I may. Oh, I want to say that the entire program of the Sistine Chapel concert, for the benefit of our singers, I actually sung it myself, even though I had a cold on that particular day. So it's not particularly vocally interesting, but if you want to hear how the melodies are related and how similar or dissimilar they are, I have placed it on my own modest YouTube channel. You can find it here, Hymns for Singers of Sistine Chapel Concert devoted to St. Nersēs the Gracious. So I shall now briefly sing to you little bits from several stanzas, with each melody being a different version from a different place, so that you will have an idea of how different and varied these versions are, and yet there is a certain consistency, which means that they work well together. And that is why I dared juxtapose melodies from geographically remote, mutually disparate places, because the aim was in that concert to display the richness of the musical tradition in a relatively short amount of time. So I will start with the first stanza. I sorangia Lusuins acum Inaugural mergadarum honari Now, different version. Elixorens and movsesi zorchoset aviciniai Jägeres carnorina gingeves pargent jerekin Es hinores pochelov est verni luis geschmagelov Ochan karinken kolov karnastut zore virelov Different one. Knabov siruin jur sireliats es delmut juren paradiats Atial badar dautai ne shavad yaskoven matnich Zorhaya yebergatsa astvadzayin vokuin Šnorhats adnetsav nachacharin and matnut yan varta bredi. Different version. Aratsein horas nutianes martgain, ja knabets adinchen, ahotet harhareris, sag ja imes, uist jergnain, so on. Next version. Argaban hats martgan ludzich vorgavet zarent gabenuin Sisartzag jadin knagaves mehats gabits tejochanuin Orent mehok margavorin gatzeran mech ihadenin, and so on. Next version. The last version, the one we sang in Venice a few days ago. And so forth. I should like to conclude by mentioning a few things. It seems the neumes did remain invariant in some instances, but not others, but the melodies did not. The transcriptions are redactions as well as transcriptions, and some general principles. We have seen some of the sophisticated ways in which one melody seems to emulate the principal motifs of another that would seem to stretch the usual definition of what constitutes a contrafactum. And so there are quite sophisticated interconnections between hymns of different eras. And some questions of authorship will probably never be resolved, not least as the very concept of authorship of melodies seems to have been an alien one. Minor discrepancies can prove useful, but of course we always need to distinguish between careless error and meaningful variation. We desperately need a reliable pneumatic source, perhaps formed through a suitable collation of selected codices. And there is fruitful work to be done comparing neumations with each other, melodies with each other, and the two with each other. I would conclude by saying that the melodies form part of an organic tradition that was not confined to manuscript documentary witnesses, but relied on an oral tradition and memory as well. But on the other hand, we ought not to conflate 19th century practices with their crude use of the ill-understood neumes with medieval practice. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much indeed for your attention, and I greatly look forward to meeting at least some of you in Portugal during the ECHOS conference, at which I've been delighted to be informed that my modest paper has been accepted. Thank you very much indeed. Do we have any questions?
Thank you very much, Haig. I'm sure we have some questions. Shall we stop the recording, please, Welma?